on a journey through the book of Acts right now, and we're actually just turning to Acts chapter 14. We kind of wrapped up 13 yesterday, and if you missed 13, you can watch back the last couple of days as we talked about Paul and Barnabas and kind of their journeys and what is happening within their journey, right? So, because in the book of Acts, what we see again is it's the movement of the gospel starting from Jerusalem, starting with the Jews only, and then including those that were converted to Judaism, and then to the Gentiles. And so now we're going along with Paul and his companion Barnabas. They're journeying through the known world at this point and talking about the gospel of Jesus Christ and how things are working. So we're going to pick up in Acts chapter 14, kind of an interesting little story, in what you'll see in this journey. Again, as I talk about, one of the best ways for you and I to understand the Word of God is to kind of put ourselves into the story and think about what would it have been like if you and I were with Paul and Barnabas, going from town to town. And you almost could think of it like, hey, you start out, maybe you're in Dyer or Cherville, and then you kind of go to the next town, then you go to the next town, you go to the next town, right? So think about it kind of in that context. They're just going from town to town. And again, what we talk about Paul, what we see with Paul is he continually goes into the synagogue, the Jewish place of worship first, and then spreads it from there. So Acts chapter 14, verse 1, now in Iconium, they entered together into the Jewish synagogue. Again, like I said, that's kind of where they go every time, and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. Okay, but and then like what we saw yesterday in Acts chapter 13, guess what? People get upset. The Jews get upset because he's starting to preach Jesus Christ as the Messiah, and they're starting to pull people away from the synagogue. All right, some jealousy. That's what we saw yesterday. Some jealousy started happening. And so what's interesting, verse 2 says this, but the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So isn't it odd that the Jews are like, no, we don't want to interact with the Gentiles, but as soon as the Church of Jesus Christ, Christians, the way, come in, they're like, oh, we need to ban with the Gentiles and get these Christians out of here. And so it didn't stop them. Verse 3, it says that they kind of remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, and still a lot of individuals were being converted. But the people of the city, verse 4, were divided, and some side with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra. Let me just tell you this. Paul, this happens to Paul everywhere he goes. They get upset with him, and they eventually, it seems like they just want to stone him. You think you got it rough, right? He had it rough. Every time he went someplace, sooner or later, someone wants to throw a rock at him. And so they're like, okay, we're out, peace, right? And so, they do that. They kind of shake the dust off, right? It's not said here, but every time they went out, they would talk about that if they're accepted, great. If not, shake the dust off. That's what Jesus would have told them to do. And so they went to Lystra, Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, or something like that, and the surrounding country. And they continued to preach the gospel, right? So everywhere they went, they preached it. We turn to verse 8, and here comes another miracle, but I want you to pay close attention to the words that we see from Paul, because they're going to be very similar words that we see from, they're talking about Peter and how they interact. And let's see if you can catch it here. So now at Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, stand upright on your feet. Did you catch it? Probably not, right? Only because sometimes it's kind of hard to try to remember everything that's going on, right? it says this. He says that he was crippled from birth and never walked. It says in verse 9, and Paul looked intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well. The idea of looking intently. Do you guys remember Peter? What Peter and said to the man who was crippled earlier, he said, hey, look at me, right? He said, look at me. And the guy thinks he's going to get alms, right? He's going to get something. And Peter says, hey, silver and gold have I none, right? And we also see Jesus looking intently in the individuals. And I point that out because there's a couple really key concepts here that I think you and I as Christians really need to grab a hold of. Number one is the idea of looking intently at someone. It means that I am totally putting my focus on that individual, okay? Now, we see Peter look intently into the individual, the magician, right? You guys remember the magician from a couple of chapters ago, right? And he's talking about, hey, look at me. I'm looking intently at you, and then just kind of tears him up. It's not Peter, so I'm sorry, it's Paul, right? But this idea that I'm putting my whole focus, and I think sometimes you and I guess I'm speaking for myself, sometimes we have such split focus, right? We've got all this stuff going on, and there's all these different needs. And yet what we see in the Bible, what we see from the disciples is they would look intently at someone, and that's where their focus would be, their ministry focus, whether it was like the magician telling them, hey, you're evil, or it was a crippled man saying, hey, get up and walk. There was an intentionality there that they said, I'm going to look intently at you. I'm going to really pay attention. I'm going to watch everything you're doing. And what the other interesting part that I find as I was reading this is that it said that Paul, as he was looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, he saw that he had faith to be made well. I don't know what that looks like. I don't. I'll just be honest with you. Pastor James, bishop of the church in the Church of God, administrative bishop, or not administrative, sorry, the chairman of the Bishops' Council. I can tell you, what does that physically look like? I can tell you what it spiritually looks like, though. See, Paul, as he looked at this individual, I believe because he was in the ruach of God, or in the Greek would be the pneuma of God, that the Spirit of God was upon him, breathing in him, giving him wisdom to be able to see not in the physical, but in the spiritual realm. And when he said he looked intently, I believe it's also not just talking physically look, but spiritually looking intensely into someone and communicating with the Spirit. It says in the scriptures that we walk by the Spirit, and that way we don't indulge the flesh, right? That you and I are spirits. In fact, this Sunday we're going to talk about the pneuma of God. And I'm excited about that sermon. But we see that Paul says that he looked intently at him, and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice. Again, he didn't see that this man was, physically ready to be made well. He saw something spiritually. Can I challenge you that you and I really have that same ability, because you and I worship the same God? That the God that Paul worshiped is the same God. He's not changed. You and I really have that. But if the key here, I think, is if we would begin to look intently at people, not just physically, but spiritually, and inside, being like ruach of God, pneuma of God, spirit, breath, wind of God, blow upon me, allow me to see the true need and the true faith of this individual, to be able to talk with and to look into. And he says to him, stand upright on your feet. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't go into anything that you and I would think, brother, do you believe in the Lord Jesus Christ? Right? You've committed sins, but I'm here to he doesn't do any of that. He doesn't get his Pentecostal swagger going. He doesn't pull out his oil. Oh, I'm meddling again, right? He doesn't go through the formulas. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago, right? He doesn't go through those normal things. He just looks at him And the Spirit tells him, I believe with my whole heart, the Ruach of God tells him, the pneuma of God, the same word in Greek and Hebrew, right? Tells him that man's ready to be healed. And so Paul goes, hey, stand upright on your feet. He's like, bro, get up. I don't know what you're doing sitting down. Get up. He doesn't tell him who, he doesn't tell him who he's represented, nothing. He just goes, this guy's ready, right? Yeah, because again, as Paul was speaking, this man was watching. So Paul, Paul, we know what Paul's talking about. He's talking about Jesus Christ, right? And so again, he doesn't make a big deal out of this. And I think it's important to understand that, right? He just looks at this guy and goes, man, this guy's ready. Boom, get up, stand up. And I love this response. And it says, and he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. And what happens next is really interesting, because we're talking about mythology at this point, right? And they look at Paul and Barnabas and like, the gods are here in likeness of man. And they look at Barnabas and he goes, oh, he's a great god Zeus. And Paul, they're like, oh, he's Hermes, because Hermes is the messenger, right? And Hermes was the one that spoke all the time. And they wanted to sacrifice for him. They wanted to do all this stuff. And Paul was like, man, we're just normal. Guys, don't treat us this way. It is because of God. The same God I was talking about, the same Jesus Christ that I was talking about, is the same God that did this. But it says in verse 17, he said, yet that he didn't leave himself without a witness. He's talking about Jesus, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, right? So he's talking about you guys you guys worship these deities, these the polytheism, right? Multiple gods of mythology. You're worshiping these that give you the rains and give you the sun and give you the seasons, right? But God is the one that does all this. But then it says, verse 18, even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifices to them. Something so powerful had showed up that they didn't know what to do but to sacrifice to the great god Zeus and the god Hermes. And Paul was like, guys, we're just normal human beings, right? It wasn't by our strength. It wasn't by our might. It was by God himself. It was by Jesus Christ. And again, as we look at this, I think as we apply this into our lives, understanding that we need to recognize you and I take a back seat, right? You and I take a back seat at what happens, right? So what I mean by that is when you and I have the opportunity, and we should be intently looking at people, allowing the Ruach, the pneuma of God to blow into us and through us and to bring life and bring prophecy and make us a warrior, give us leadership skills and give us abilities. We should allow all that. But then at the end of this day, we also say, it's not me. This breath is not mine, but God's alone. This ability is not mine, but God's alone. And so that's my challenge for you today as we kind of end this part of the story. We're going to see, I'll just give you a hint. Yes, it involves stones, right? It involves rocks. We're going to talk about the next part of Acts chapter 14 tomorrow. But again, I just really challenge you. Let's start looking intently at people. People need us, but they need us to be the conduit through which the Ruach of God flows through, where the breath of God can flow through. Love you guys. We'll talk to you tomorrow.